Most retirement plans assume the same spending every year, possibly adjusted for inflation. But in real life, markets move, which can affect your comfort with how much you're spending. And if you're thinking about retirement income, this is one of the most important concepts to understand because this isn't just about giving yourself raises later, it's about being able to start with a higher income and possibly reduce the chances of running out of money. So, what happens if we take a more sophisticated and realistic approach to retirement spending? Well, that's where dynamic spending or flexible spending come in. With those approaches, you adjust your withdrawals, and that's primarily due to market movements, how your investments are doing. And this isn't just random or based on your gut. You're using rules and using intentionality to do this. That way, you don't have to cut your spending every time you see red on the screen. And in reality, I see clients doing this on their own. They often request to reduce their withdrawals even before they need to when the market is down. And that's why having some structure can be helpful. So the basic idea here is to be able to spend more when things are going well, and you may have to cut your spending a bit, or at least temporarily, when things are not going well. That sounds pretty simple, but why would you really want to do this? There are two potential benefits. One is starting with a higher income than you would otherwise start with a basic inflation-adjusted withdrawal strategy like the 4% rule. The other is that you can possibly reduce the risk of running out of money. So if we look at the traditional 4% rule, the idea is that you're ideally using a safe withdrawal rate. You pick a number that's low enough that it should, in theory, at least historically, not have you running out of money over a 30-year period. But that number might be lower than it needs to be. The reason it happened to be so low in the research is because you never change anything. So if things are going badly, then you just continue blindly taking out whatever you were supposed to take each year and adjusting it for inflation. But if things go well, maybe you could have taken out more. If things went badly, maybe you could have started at a higher rate and made some cuts occasionally. But that ability to withdraw more only works if you're willing and able to do something that most people don't like. You may need to cut your spending, possibly by more than you want and possibly for longer than you want. But when we look at historical data, the fact is these cuts can be relatively small and they tend to be temporary. So it usually isn't about a permanent sacrifice. It could potentially be a temporary adjustment. Just as important, this doesn't just go in one direction. So if markets are doing well, you can potentially increase your spending. A lot of people forget that part. So if things are going well, you could travel more, give more money away, or otherwise upgrade your lifestyle. So how do you actually decide when to adjust? The idea is that if your portfolio drops to a certain level, then you cut your spending by a certain dollar amount. If the portfolio recovers, then you can increase the spending again. Now let's glance at some research and a structured way to do this. There are a couple of different flavors of guardrails, but right now we're talking about risk-based guardrails. You've got an amount you're going to withdraw, and you've got an upper and lower guardrail. So if you start out with, let's say, $800,000, and if the portfolio grows to a certain amount, let's say $846,000, then you could give yourself a little raise. But if the portfolio drops, in this case, down to $638,000, then you would have to take a bit of a pay cut. And as you can see here, the difference in these two is about $300 either way. We're not talking about a drastic change. The pay cut of about $260 is a 5% pay cut, or the raise is about 6%. Now, this is an iterative process, so if markets continued to fall, then you may need to take additional cuts. And you can kind of dial all of this in. So you can say, well, I want to have more adjustments, or I want to have fewer adjustments. I don't want to, have to adjust this all the time. And that can affect how you start your income. The benefit of this type of approach is that it gives you some clear rules and removes emotion from the picture. And this isn't just theory or pretty software. There's some actual research behind why this approach might make sense. Every year, Morningstar updates their research on what they call a safe withdrawal rate, and that's given their expectations of what the markets are going to do and that sort of thing. And what tends to happen is that the dynamic spending strategies often have a higher starting withdrawal rate than just the fixed methods. So in this case, they've got 3.9% as a starting withdrawal rate. And that is where, again, you start with a percentage of what you have saved for retirement. Then whatever that amount is, 3.9% of everything you have, You might withdraw that amount and then adjust that for inflation every year going forward and not make changes due to other things. But once you start adding in some dynamic strategies like missing inflation adjustments, this is what you do. If the market was down in a given year, you wouldn't take the inflation adjustment in the following year. Well, then you could maybe start with a higher withdrawal rate. Or if you're using guardrails, and in this instance, they're talking the Guyton-Klinger guardrails, but the ones we looked at previously over here were risk-based guardrails, or Vanguard's dynamic spending, which is a floor and ceiling approach, if I recall correctly. So all of these methods have their pros and cons, and you might say, well, I just want the one with the biggest withdrawal rate so I can start with the highest income and I'll make adjustments as needed. But what you might want to keep in mind is the volatility, or how upsy downsy your withdrawals might get, because that's kind of important. So they've got that kind of illustrated here in the 30-year cash flow standard deviation. And what you would see is that the risk-based guardrails have a lower volatility than the traditional Guyton-Klinger guardrails. So you might say, well, this traditional Guyton-Klinger guardrails is 5.2% starting withdrawal rate versus the risk-based guardrails at 5.1%. Why don't I take that extra 0.1%? I'm sure I can find something to do with that money. But it's also important to consider how volatile the spending might get, or how much you might need to cut your spending, especially during hard times. That's, I think, the thing that's most important to people. And they do illustrate that as well with how the cash flows change. And what you can see is the probability-based guardrails have less upsy-downsiness, let's call it as an official term, than the traditional Guyton-Klinger guardrails. So that doesn't mean it's better, but you would want to consider that as you're deciding what kind of spending cuts do I want to sign myself up for. And I also want to briefly point out from some Kitz's research, for those of you who are wondering about the 4% rule, why don't I just do that? That sounds pretty good. That could result in underspending, and that means you're missing the opportunity to make some memories, or you could possibly retire earlier. You could possibly retire with less. Maybe that means setting aside less each year for retirement, or just being able to retire. If we look at historically how that actually worked out, if you started with $100,000, and depending on what year you started your retirement, in many cases, the $100,000 line is down here. I guess you can't see my mouse, but 100,000 is pretty far down on that chart. And in many of the cases, you end up dying, or you end up 30 years later at least, with quite a bit more than $100,000. So again, this is where some dynamic spending strategies, or being able to change what you're spending, could potentially be helpful. But there is a catch here, and it has nothing to do with the actual math. It's just that people don't like cutting their spending. They might be in denial, might want to wait it out, might not be able to afford to. So you really want to think about, before you go down the path of using one of these strategies, think about really how willing and able you are to cut your spending if need be. And one way to make this easier is to think about which spending is actually flexible, because not all spending is created equal. So you might want to look at categories, things like housing, insurance, basic living and eating. Those are the types of expenses that we don't want to see cut. But you might be more flexible on travel and dining and discretionary purchases, upgrading a vehicle. It's best to think of all of this not as restriction, but as adaptability and responsiveness. You end up trading a little bit of certainty for a lot more flexibility, and in many cases, a better outcome. So I hope that helps paint the picture of what flexible spending actually looks like in retirement. If you found it helpful, please leave a quick thumbs up, check out my website, maybe send me an email if you'd like to talk.